Welcome to the new Hegelian Philosophy channel. Today we will begin a new study of the philosophy of Michel Foucault by having a full book overview of his classic text, Madness and Civilization. Now, if one were to try to sum this book up very quickly, I think the main idea would be something like the following. In Madness and Civilization, Foucault shows that although we take for granted today that madness has always intrinsically meant just one thing, an examination of the history of views of madness within Europe from the end of the Middle Ages up until the 20th century, when Foucault wrote this text, will show something very different. It will show that madness actually meant many different things over many different times. Now, one's first reaction upon hearing that might be to object by saying, well, of course, people in the past thought differently about madness, but that's just because they were wrong. Of course, without the benefit of modern science, they would think, for example, that madness was caused by an excess of reading books about things that don't exist, as is the case in Don Quixote, rather than attribute madness to some sort of quote-unquote problem in the hardwiring of the brain as a biological machine. Of course, they would think such things in the past, but that's just because they didn't know as well as we do, because, well, we've just gotten smarter than them, or we have better scientific methods, etc. Foucault shows, in reality, the current definition of madness is not the result of better knowledge, better methods, etc. It's rather the result of completing something which had been ongoing for the whole history of views of madness, which is the progressive silencing of madness itself. What you really have in the modern definition of madness that you achieve with, say, Sigmund Freud isn't even just a better scientific view of the physical origins of madness, because Freud explicitly did not favor that. Instead, Freud said that his whole explanation of madness and the treatment thereof would be restricted to the realm of language, because within psychoanalysis, you simply use language to guide the troubled person to the origin of their psychological problems by undoing repression, for example, to find the repressed memories from very, very far back in the past, which are now manifesting themselves as involuntary symptoms and reactions, etc. And through using language alone, you can undo that madness by having its flawed language be put in the presence of the correct language of reason itself. And therefore, regardless of the appeals to physiological explanations of madness, etc., the real point of modernity is to have madness be put in such a position that even if it does speak in the presence of the proper language of reason, it will still be silenced, because its language will be proven a priori to be inferior to the proper language of reason. And that's the real point of this long trajectory. So by writing this history, reconstructing what has been forgotten, in many ways Foucault is simply undoing that silence. He's simply allowing that madness to speak again. Now, as we get into the text itself, we find that in the first chapter, we go all the way back to the end of the Middle Ages. This is like, say, the 14th, 15th centuries, etc., to find kind of the start of the trajectory that led to this modern view of madness. And interestingly, what you find there as the origin of this long history is sociological in nature rather than medical, quote-unquote, in nature. What you find there, interestingly, is that madness took the place within the social order that had been left behind with the disappearance of leprosy. So sociologically, leprosy was something which had to be kind of excluded to the margins of society, excluded to the outside. And when leprosy kind of vanished from the Western world at the end of the medieval era, you had to have that structural position within the social order filled by something which came to be viewed as a new incarnation of disease, despite the fact that before it had not been viewed that way, in order to justify this view of a new sort of purification and exclusion that would have to be applied to it. And that's kind of how the modern view of madness actually gets started. So you have leprosy disappear as a physical presence. but it remains as, say, a moral presence in the sense that it remains as something which is always threatening to contaminate the rest of society and therefore has to be dealt with through these structures of control which eventually lead to confinement. Now, it's not actually confined just yet, for you'll notice that at this time you have the image of the ship of fools, which might at first kind of look like an early version of the insane asylum. You load the madman onto a ship that sails down the canals or down the rivers from town to town, keeping those mad individuals outside of the social order into a space that looks kind of like a floating prison, but it's actually not that at all. Foucault notes that this actually isn't an era yet in which it would be taken for granted that the mad would need to be confined at all. Although they're banished from walking the public spaces of the streets within the city, they're allowed to wander pretty freely out there in the countryside. And the reason really that the ship of fools is sent into the water is the symbolic need for purification. There was also a lot of imagery in the Middle Ages associating the leper with water in the hope of purifying them in the way that you see, say, within the accounts of healing of lepers miraculously within the New Testament. So the bigger emphasis in both cases is for religious redemption and salvation for the soul rather than a medical cure for the body. Now, it's not a coincidence that at this point what you also don't find is any idea of personal responsibility or guilt for having ended up in this state, because unreason is something which is not viewed at this time as so easy to blame on anyone. It's something for which nothing, in fact, is exactly responsible, to quote Foucault himself. So with that presupposition removed, the idea that something is responsible for it, you also lose the imperative to have to take action now to immediately cure it. In contrast, the madman is allowed to wander freely in the countryside because it's understood that there's not really anything which can or should be done to correct his state of unreason. It's only really in the later eras of post-medieval rationalism that it would be thought that the way that the madman acts is inherently in need of rehabilitation and confinement. In this era, it's not exactly viewed as a problem. With the Prince of Fools, for example, you'll notice that he's actually a pleasure to be around. Now, for this very reason, madness was not yet seen as always totally antithetical to reason. That was something which would come to be absolutized only in the modern era, when you have the purely rational language of the Freudian psychoanalyst or the psychiatrist who knows better with the benefits of modern science, in contrast with the madman who's completely lacking in reason. In this era, the two were not polar opposites or mutually exclusive terms just yet. As I mentioned earlier in this video, Don Quixote actually portrays madness as the result of an excess of knowledge rather than a total lack thereof. The figure of Don Quixote goes mad not from lacking knowledge, but rather with overfilling his head with stuff that he read in books. Now, in the second chapter, titled The Great Confinement, we find that this very unfamiliar view of madness that I've just described to you transformed into the image of madness much more familiar to us today, largely as a result of having madness be immobilized and, of course, after being restricted in its movement, being confined. We have to be very careful, however, to note that this confinement in the 17th century is not yet anything like an insane asylum, because although it is true that the mad were locked up, it was not for the purpose of putting them into an institution in which they would be medically rehabilitated to be reasonable and no longer mad. We take that for granted today, but the image in the 17th century itself is very different. Rather, in the 17th century, you have the mad locked up with many other types of people who were not considered mad. There was a general confinement in which people who were unemployed and therefore quote-unquote useless, who could perhaps be put to more productive labor forcibly, were locked up, along with people who had committed crimes, including young men who had squandered their families' money, and the poor in general. These people were all locked up into a confinement structure that was not yet a medical establishment. The point there was not to rehabilitate these people into less mad or less criminally prone individuals as we would take for granted today. Rather, the goal of the confinement was the establishment of order for its own sake. This emphasis on order over medicine can be found in the way that when the confined were spoken of in this era, there was never really an emphasis on monitoring them in terms of illness or health and the progress they were making thereof. Rather, the emphasis was always on contrasting idleness and labor. This is why people who were not mad were locked up with the mad, because they had all been identified as problematic because they were not productive enough to society in their current state, and therefore had to be coerced to be productive by, for example, doing work in sewers that nobody else wanted to do, but somebody had to do. Likewise, the record-keeping of this era only emphasized the value of the work done by the inmates, rather than track their medical progress, let alone as individuals, as you would find much later on. In the third chapter, titled The Sane, we find that although the mad were confined with the non-mad in this era, there was one important difference between the treatment of the two. As time went on, you found that although most people at this time were confined precisely for the purpose of being removed from the public eye, many people were confined for reasons of scandal. You think of a young girl, for example, who had to be taken out of the public because she had brought shame to her family name through her immorality. Well, the exception to this is, of course, the madman. The madman was paradoxically removed from society through being confined, and yet also thrust back into the public eye through being shown within the asylum, in much the same way that an animal would be within a zoo or a circus. And indeed, that is how they were treated. The mad were forced to do things like, say, perform tricks in response to the whipping of the guard within the asylum. They would even charge fees for visitors to come and watch this freak show, turning the madman into a literal monster. We keep in mind that in Latin, monstrare means to show. Well, the madman had to be removed, but also had to appear, because rather than confine him for the purpose of medical rehabilitation or even punishment, it's not that the madman had done something specific wrong that required this amount of punishment to compensate for it, as we would take for granted today. Rather, the madman was confined and then turned into a source of income for these people, because he was basically viewed at this time as not a human who had lost his reason and could get it back, but rather as basically an animal. Just as you would keep animals in the zoo or a circus, not because you were trying to rehabilitate them or punishment, but just because you found it useful. That's basically what happened to the madman at this time. He would literally be treated like a dog by having a leash tied around his neck, which allowed him to be led by a person in another room on the other side of a wall. And this view of the mad as animals was confirmed at this time by references to a quote-unquote human stable, which showed a major shift from the treatment of the mad in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the mad were not seen as people who had dropped down to the status of animals, but rather people who had risen up to the status of becoming mouthpieces for supernatural beings like the gods. You may keep in mind that the epic poems start with invoking the muse to basically have the poet suffer a form of madness in which another voice would speak through him. This is the voice of the muse, which would allow him to say basically the words of the gods. Well, that was a very, very different view of madness at that time. That the idea of being possessed by a supernatural force. A very, very different view from this one, which basically treats the mad as human animals, and indeed this was used to justify depriving them of the most basic living conditions in the space of confinement. It was argued that the mad didn't need to be given proper blankets and heating in the winter because, like an animal, they could endure more cold, which actually showed that the mad at this time were explicitly not viewed as people who were sick, because rather than suffer from a sickness that inhibited their health, they actually had an excess of strength like an animal, and this excess of strength allowed them to endure the kind of harsh treatment that you would expect for animals within a zoo or a circus. Now, in the fourth chapter, titled Passion and Delirium, another view of madness which evolved over time placed the blame on the passions. Now, the passions are viewed in this pre-Cartesian era as the meeting point or intersection between the two sides of the self, which are not yet seen as the mind and the body, as res cogitans and res extens, but rather in a more moralistic sense. The two sides of the self were viewed as the body and the soul in the Christian sense of the term. Now, the passions had the ability to overwhelm themselves and actually cancel themselves out, but this was precisely through an excess of power rather than a privation or a weakness or a sickness as we would expect today. Rather, because they were so powerful, they could drive a person who let them get out of hand into a state of immobilization, which would then lead them to fall into a type of madness in which they would start generating chimeras, hallucinations, and images of things which don't exist. The problem in this case was that one might use language to say things which on the surface sound perfectly reasonable, but would lose their truth value through being associated with these chimeras. So we see that once again here the emphasis is on the image rather than on the language. The language becomes problematic precisely through being associated with the non-existent image and affirming that it actually exists, affirming the being of something characterized only by non-being. So as we move on to the fifth chapter, Aspects of Madness, we find that in the 16th and 17th centuries, there was the beginning of a very primitive attempt to do psychiatry within Europe, which led people to do something which on the surface will seem very familiar to us today, which is to try to provide physical explanations for the origin of psychological problems. The problem, of course, is that the explanations themselves will sound totally unscientific to us today. So, there was an emphasis on wild dialectical swings into opposites and a fluidity of contradiction. There was emphasis on explaining away origin of madness through an excess or lack of heat within the body, fibrous tension, agitation of the spirits, and the vivacity of internal impressions, the rapid association of ideas and inattention. Now, this is something which shows us that even though we take for granted today that the physical explanation of madness is always more rational, we find that these explanations actually don't sound that way to us at all, which might lead one to question whether our own explanations of madness in physical terms are any better than these. Well, in the sixth chapter titled Doctors, Patients, we find that the classical period was also defined by a shift from curing the disease within the person to instead curing the whole person. This is the idea of rehabilitation that you also see in the history of the prison, in which in Discipline and Madness, Foucault noted that the very primitive forms of punishment that you found in the pre-modern period would use brute force to compensate for a crime done by the person, often just killing them. But that was a very, very barbaric and unsophisticated treatment of the criminal in comparison with the modern prison, which actually seeks to rehabilitate them by changing the whole person through these disciplinary methods. And we find something like that in this chapter, actually. Even with the good intention of trying to reintegrate the whole person back into a state of sanity, you find that the way that that's actually done is to coerce the body to involuntarily interiorize certain movements early on largely taken from the rhythm and order of nature itself. So the idea was that the rhythm and order of nature is something that one could have one's own body adopt, that rhythm and order, in order to have oneself be rehabilitated into a sane person once again. For this reason, the prescriptions given for the mad will sound really strange to us today. A mad person might be prescribed to be put in the presence of the movements of the sea, okay? Because the movements of the sea, that natural movement, would help regulate the madman's own movement back into a natural state. Similarly, people were prescribed to travel to new places, to take walks, or to do horseback riding, because this was supposed to stimulate the flow of ideas within the mind by first stimulating the movement of the body back into its proper rhythms. The cure for madness was therefore to force the madman to leave the state of pure subjectivity, which is being stuck in his head, in order to join in with the objectively given movements of nature. Now, unfortunately, although this may have started with good intentions, and certainly the things I just mentioned prescribed sound very pleasant, very quickly this turned into a form of punishment. For immersion into water would be prescribed because water was the single purest and most basic of all the elements, but if the madman had to be coerced into accepting the water, well, then it bordered on a form of torture. You have accounts of madmen forcibly strapped into a chair and then showered with cold water over the top of their heads, which kind of sounds like waterboarding. Now, the goal was once again to restore the mobility of life to a madman who had been paralyzed into a state of pure subjectivity, but the movement came to become a form of torture itself in situations like the following. Now, you may have heard of the famous rotary machine, which came to be used as a form of treatment for the madman, attaching him to a bed which was hung from an arm that was moving around a pillar. This was moved by a system of gears which could be set at a desired speed by the rehabilitators. Now, strangely, whereas movement was before prescribed to restore unity with the outside world, under these conditions, movement instead produced interior effects of a wholly mechanical and psychological kind. No longer was the presence of truth what would determine the cure, that is to say, the truth of the external world one would rejoin. Rather, this movement turned into a functional norm, plain and simple. This very quickly devolved into an instrument of punishment, plain and simple. Rather than accept the discomfort of adjusting to the natural order as a means to an end for the healing process, one could simply turn that discomfort and coercion into an end in itself. Now, as we get into the 7th chapter, we find that at the end of the 18th century, there came to be a new fear associated with the places of confinement, because if diseases were spreading in the city, it was assumed that they started there. After epidemics broke out, angry mobs would even threaten to burn the insane asylum down. One recurring image in this era is the rotting air of the asylum, leaking out into the clean air of nature. Not only the diseases of the mad, but even madness itself, therefore, came to be viewed as something contagious. There was a fear that anyone could abruptly cross the line from insanity, either without cause or from coming into contact with one of these infectors. Now, the irony is that the progress towards reinterpreting madness as an inherently psychological, rather than, say, moral issue, was achieved precisely through this sort of regression that characterized this era. The stereotypical view of the House of the Mad as a site of contagious diseases that would then spread out to the rest of the city to infect the whole population is exactly what led to the renewed attention on madness itself, which became the field of psychology as we know it today. Madness only came to be scientifically medicalized as a result of falling into the spotlight, where it appeared as the pseudo-scientific image of a monstrous disease associated with the totally unrelated values of immorality and evil. Another reason for this increased attention on madness was that it fueled one's curiosity and fascination through urban legends about what went on in that madhouse. There were accounts of out-of-control nights of unrestricted pleasure that supposedly went on in an insane asylum, which only betrayed one's own projection of the shadow onto the other. Yet at this stage, madness remained ambiguous. Was it a contagious disease of the body, or was it the absence of reason in the mind? Well, this is something which was left unresolved in this era, because, as we find in Chapter 8, The New Division, by the 19th century, the mad were sent back to the prison yet again. This was a strange situation, though, because it only came to an end as a result of the convicted, the criminals, demanding to no longer be in the presence of the mad rather than the other way around. It was strange that the criminals were the ones who became so discomforted by this arrangement that they begged for it to stop. There were accounts of the cries and confusion of the insane causing a confusion within the house of confinement. The criminals were not able to sleep because of the excessive noise being made by the insane. Now, because there was still an emphasis in this era on trying to have the useless become more productive to society again, you started to medicalize the treatment of the mad within houses of confinement, largely because you wanted to better understand how to make them more productive. So you start to see an individualization of one's knowledge about them, keeping records, tracking, etc. Originally, because there were attempts to make these people who were more difficult to forced to work than people who were, say, just criminals or just beggars. That was the original motivation, but it eventually became something we know today, of course, as the field of psychiatry. Now, as we finally reach the 9th chapter, The Birth of the Asylum, we find an image that is all too familiar to us. The birth of psychiatry is portrayed as the happy moment in history when madness was finally recognized for what it had always been, and more importantly, treated accordingly by the experts who really understood it, in contrast with all those other people I mentioned over the course of this book who did not. Now, the problem with this particular image is that it treats psychiatry's knowledge of madness is something that arose basically out of nowhere and then suddenly recognized what had always been obvious, but which had always been missed by everyone else. The truth, of course, is far more complicated than this historical caricature which has been left behind. In reality, psychiatry did not appear out of nowhere, but kind of grew out of the practice of sending the mad away on religious retreats. The purpose of doing this was largely to have the mad spend a lot of time examining their conscience. Now, examining the conscience before the Roman Catholic practice of confession, for example, would allow them to spend hours thinking over and over again in the privacy of their own thoughts what they had done wrong, and more importantly, to accept that nobody else was responsible for it. Examining the conscience, he would find that there's nobody else, nothing else to blame except oneself. For if we really have the free will to choose not to sin, well, then all you can do is accept that guilt and perhaps as a result of that be liberated from madness back into sanity. The problem, of course, is that in reality, things weren't always quite as simple as just that. In the situation of the religious retreat, it wasn't actually just the madman examining his own conscience for hours on end. There was also, beyond that, an asymmetrical power relation within the institution between the figure of the priest and the figure of the sinner, which basically became later on the relation between the psychoanalyst and the madman. In addition, the sinner within the religious retreat wasn't expected to just spend all of those hours thinking. They were also expected to do work, but the funny thing about this work was that it was precisely to have no instrumental or utilitarian value. One was prescribed useless work for the sole purpose of correcting the soul on a moralistic level. One of these really strange examples of a useless task prescribed to the mad in these retreats was that they were expected to attend bizarre mock tea parties. At the mock tea party, the madmen would be forced to act out proper manners but for no one except himself to contemplate. Here we find a very strange relation in which there is no reciprocity at all. The madman exists only to be seen by the impersonal gaze of those within authority, which later came to be, of course, transferred over to the insane asylum itself. This led to a very strange reversal. Whereas before, madness was what caused others to be afraid of its monstrous excesses put on display, now instead the madman was the one who had to be afraid. He had to be afraid at all times of being judged by those who could view him and talk about him without any possibility of him returning the favor. For even if the madman did speak in the presence of such a figure of authority, he would still be paradoxically silenced, because it was already known a priori that the language of the figure of authority bore truth, whereas the language of the madman was falsity. This became psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is basically just a secularized version of the confessional, because the sinner acknowledges his guilt before a priest who already knows everything about his state, in much the same way that in psychoanalysis, the madman may speak, but the psychoanalyst already knows what the origin of the problem is, which is the Oedipal complex, the repressed memories from early childhood, the conflict between the unconscious and the conscious, the ego and the id, etc. Unlike the old prison guards, though, the psychiatrist doesn't have to be armed with anything except observation and language, because with those two things, his authority is sufficient. The only thing he really needs to have authority is, well, to not be mad. That and that alone allows him to have supremacy over the madman, in which there's not even need for a violent struggle between the two, because it's clear that reason has already won. This is because psychoanalysis ultimately tries to rehabilitate the madman by reincorporating him into the most primitive and basic of all social structures, which is the nuclear family. The analyst does this by standing as the father figure, who now must be obeyed for moral rather than utilitarian purposes. As a result, the madman is permanently infantilized and put into a state like a child against the figure of authority that will never be able to reverse or be reciprocated. Even as he grows old, then, he can never really grow up, because the father figure causes the madman to always remain in such a state. Under such conditions, there's no longer any need for the chains of old, since having to acknowledge oneself as mad is sufficient. Reason holds up the mirror in which the madman is humiliated by his own reflection. Now the madman knows that he's being watched at all times by the sane, and that anything he does can and will be observed. It will be documented, and it will be interpreted as further proof of his inferior status as an insane person. This is a perpetual and never-ending punishment, like what Foucault described in Discipline and Punish, because madness must also constantly judge itself through being caught up in the pincers of perpetual silence and observation. And that will complete our reading of Foucault's Madness and Civilization. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to more videos on Foucault.